I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is JAUNAY. Graham is president of the South Australian Genealogical and Hereditary Society and past president of the Australasian Federation of Family History and Organisations. Formerly a school principal in South Australia, has been a professional genealogist since 1994. Calling on his interest in family history, Graham will address the background of the numerous fair assistance schemes that encouraged all sorts of settlers in the early 19th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Graham JAUNAY.
Thank you. Before I start tonight, the picture on the screen happens to be a representation, I have to say representation because nobody really knows, of the China which arrived in Adelaide for the first time in December 1847. It's been painted, it's a watercolour, it's been painted by the marine historian artist John Ford of Port Adelaide. 3 leagues off Holdfast Bay with my ancestors standing on the vessel pointing to where they're going to live, which is why I have to say it's a bit of a fanciful thing. You can see that the sails are starting to be furled, ready to enter the Port River. Now, of course, as a genealogist, a lot of people come to me wanting to know about how their families arrived in South Australia. I spend more time on probably that topic than anything else. And of course, the first thing I want is a photograph, which is a bit of a big ask, isn't it? And indeed, there's no known painting of the China, and so we can only say it's a representation of it. Indeed, we use the weather readings for South Australia to make sure we got the waves right and the amount of sail up that we would expect to have, and it's not using its best sails, it's only using the second set of sails, which is why they look a bit rusty and dirty. Best sails are not used when you're sailing in the seas, you only use them when you're near ports. So you kept them for good, like my Sunday best. So that's the China. Of course, everybody here, I think everybody here probably has an ancestor who came out on a vessel or an aeroplane at some time to South Australia to settle. This vessel represents the earliest of my ancestors coming to South Australia. The last were in 1894 on a vessel called the Ormuz. By then they were steamships. And if you go up to the back corner where there's a cabin trunk and a little display, you'll see a vessel pictured as of that era. And if you look at that vessel and this vessel, you can see the vast technological advances that were made in those 40-odd, 50 years. We talked today about great advances in technology. Well, those great advances have been going on for some considerable time. The family of mine who came out in 1894 being the Jaunays, who emigrated from France to South Australia. Well, they actually came to Victoria first and found it not to their liking, appropriately so. They came out to show Victorians at Stawell how to make champagne, and they wanted to make it like lemonade, which of course my French ancestors were a bit indignant about, and I can just imagine him telling them so. So the next thing we do is find him in the Barossa Valley at the Adelaide Wine Company, which of course is now known as Chateau Tanunda. Okay, well that's just an aside. I'm very dangerous when I get on asides and end up being the whole talk, and you're here to hear about other things, so I'll get on with what I'm here to talk about. There were numerous fair assistance schemes operating in the 19th century to try and encourage settlement to South Australia, and some of the records for these voyages have survived and many have not. And if we could locate these records, which have been generated by mainly government bureaucracies, then it can be very useful to all historians and especially family historians. However, the shipping records as such, which are held by state records, are not the only items that are available for researchers into people arriving into South Australia. And there's a whole host of other non-shipping type material which can often give people the answers to their questions. Let's start right at the beginning with the South Australian Colonisation Commission, which was organised by Robert Torrens in early 1835. And the task of that commission was to secure settlers for South Australia. And when you think about it, that's a pretty adventurous thing to do, to pack up everything and come across to the other side of the world. I mean, when we go on, my family and I go on holidays quite frequently, and we think about it quite a bit, especially today with terrorism and so forth. So the way that the Commission dealt with this was a massive publicity campaign right through the United Kingdom, and appointing agents in major market towns right across the country, and also speaking to guardians of the poor. In 1835 we still had, this is still the time before workhouses were established. They were established by the 1835 Poor Law Act in England, and up until 1835 each parish was responsible for its poor, and they were a bit of a burden on the community. Everybody living in a parish who earned an income had to pay a poor tax or poor levy to maintain the poor, and so there was always schemes going on to try and move the poor on somewhere else, and the Commission saw this as a chance to move some of the poor on well and truly out of the scene. The problem, of course, with moving poor into South Australia was when they got here they didn't suddenly become rich, and this was a major problem that the early colonies faced. And they conducted poster campaigns and lecture tours right across the UK to try and encourage people to take on the idea of settling in a new province. And but by 1840 they'd really burnt out, and so the whole concept was handed over to the Colonial Land and Immigration Commission, which was appointed as an agent by the South Australian government. Now that commission actually dealt with immigration all over the place, not just to South Australia. The way that South Australia, I feel as though I'm talking to people like Coles to Newcastle. You all know this, so I don't know why I'm here telling you this, but anyway, the way that the Wakefield and his planners decided that South Australia would be organised was there'd be the two groups or two classes of people, the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots would be those who looked after the haves. And I'm just putting it a bit basic, but anyway. So the haves were the people who bought the land that was available here in South Australia, and they were going to be the landed gentry of the colony or province. And the other people who were paid to come out here were the people who were going to service those people, be they servants, shopkeepers, or whatever. And so we have these two classes of people. And that was the way the thing operated until 1840, when they ran out of money. They established this land fund, and when people purchased land, the money was then put aside to fund passage for these other people to come out to the colony. And so in 1840, when they ran out of money, they had to stop the whole scheme. And so we have very early in our colony's history, a halt on assisted passage sponsored by government. Now, if we just look at those records though before 1841, this was the period when these people who were funded to come out to South Australia, they gained what we would call free passage. This is the only period in our history where people actually gained free passage. When the assisted system resumed in 1847, it was always then assisted passage, and it was assisted passage right on from there on in. But these early days, the first few years of our province's life, the people who were coming out to do the everyday tasks of the community gained free passage. This era, as a result, has the best surviving set of records of the people coming to South Australia, because everybody who sought free passage is recorded in the Register of Immigrant Labourers applying for free passage to South Australia. That register has survived, and it's in the Public Record Office, which is now the National Archives, at Kew in London, and on the screen you can see the reference number there if you want to look at it. It's been filmed by the Australian Joint Copying Project on 35mm film, and the rules are numbers 874 through to 875, and those films are widely available right throughout Adelaide. You can go to the State Library and see them, you can go down to State Records and see them, you can go to the Genealogy Society and see them. If you wish, you could even buy them for yourself. You might have a bit of a problem reading 35mm film, but you could actually buy them for yourself. And everybody who arrived in South Australia is recorded, right down to those that are 15 years and older. Everybody that was 15 and older was considered to be adult, with some exceptions. If you were the wife of a free passage applicant, it didn't record your name. The only thing of significance was your age. And if you were a child, it didn't record your name either, it just recorded your age. But all single people and all married men are certainly recorded. And there are ways and means of actually determining some of these unnamed people in the list, because indeed in that period there are surviving passenger lists, and while more often than not they do just name the passengers as Mr. and Mrs. Jones, now and again they do name individual people in them. So unfortunately, when the land fund collapsed and this all came to an end, that was the end of the very good set of records that we had of people coming to South Australia. But I might just add that those people who paid to come in that period are not recorded. We've got to keep reminding ourselves that these records were prepared by governments, and especially their accounting sections. So they weren't really interested in the people who paid their own way. We have to remind ourselves that the province of South Australia was just one part of the empire. And just like today, you don't have to get any paperwork to go to Brisbane. Likewise, then, you didn't have to get any paperwork to travel to Australia, because it's just another part of the country, if you like. And so this is often a problem that many people find, that their ancestors actually paid their passage, and when paying your passage, that is a contract between the shipping company and you when you buy a ticket. And so unless that shipping company's records have survived, or there are some other reasons for that material surviving, then it's unlikely that you'll find any records pertaining to paid people. Now, sometimes there are other records available that do lead us to these people, and I'll talk about that later on this evening. While the Land Fund fizzled out in 1840, there was still the conveyor belt of people coming out couldn't stop, so that we still get people arriving into 1841 before it dries up completely. But during from 1841 until the assisted passage scheme was introduced in late 1846, 1847, it doesn't mean nobody came to South Australia. All those people still paying for their passage came, and a whole lot of other people who were funded by other organisations other than government also came during that period, and I'll talk about those other people as well later on tonight. So when assisted immigration resumed in 1846, and we get the first people arriving in 1847 on the resumption of the program, we never ever get as generous an offer as we had beforehand. Indeed, as the people, my ancestors on the China, probably shouldn't have even gained an assisted passage, and I'll tell you why. On the China was one George Dickerson and his wife Phoebe, nee Lana, formerly Spooner, formerly Cannell, much married lady, and George and her daughter was the wife of one George Johnson, from whom I descend from that marriage. When George Dickerson, who got an assisted passage on the China, arrived in South Australia in December 1847, within 2 years he had bought property at Tea Tree Gully costing £1,000. Now, I've got a sneaking suspicion he might be what we would call a modern-day invader of tax, because in actual fact, if he could find £1,000 that quickly after arriving here, I've got a sneaking suspicion he really wasn't entitled to assisted passage. Because the assisted passages that were offered by the South Australian government to still bring out people, because we still needed to have population here. One of the fears of our early colony was the fact that such a small population could not only sustain itself, it couldn't defend itself. And so the assisted passage scheme that started again in 1846, 1847 addressed those shortages. And that system continued right through until 1886. But it's not just one scheme. Over that period of some 40 years, there are numerous little schemes within the major scheme. And if we look at the Government Gazette for 1866, we can see an example of why people were brought out to Australia. There's an interesting little snippet on page 133 of the February the 1st Gazette, and in case you can't read it, it talks about granting passage, a complaint about granting passage to unskilled labourers. We just don't want that sort of person here. We only want you to grant passage to skilled labourers. We weren't in the game here of training up of people. We wanted them to all come already trained. And so that's an example just out of one gazette of numerous of instructions where the government is making sure that it's getting people that it wants, that it needs to maintain a decent economy and defence of the colony. And so we have all these schemes. Now I've already discussed the first two, which are the free ones, and then we've got this period from 1840 to 1845 where there's no assisted passage. Then it resumes in 1845-46, and you can see in each case there are very definite criteria. So first wave of people we're looking for are agricultural labourers, domestics and farm servants, and mechanics to go out into the countryside, and miners. So that's what we're looking for, and that's what we would have required the Commission to search out for us. The number of men coming out on the passage, the number of unmarried men on any one vessel had to be equated to the number of unmarried women, so that we'd already starting to experience the problem of too many men in the colony, and I suppose some fear by social designers that could cause a problem down the track. So married adults under 40 were wanted. If you were over 40, not interested. Boys 14 to 16 were welcomed, and girls, single women were welcome, and all those people had to pay £1 to come out to South Australia. A single man, £2. We weren't quite as keen on them. We had a few too many of them already. And children under the age of 15, 10 shillings. And the government found the rest. And then again, we see another scheme that starts in 1848, whereby we look for people who are very much selected on the case of what they employ, their skills were, but you can see that we put the fees up a bit. Now the interesting thing is in that first period, 1845 to 1848, is when my George Dickinson would have come out with his £1,000 tucked in his underwear, I suppose. I don't know where else he'd keep it. And then we move on to the 1852 to 1862, and we start looking at nominating people out. The people that are already out here are given the opportunity to nominate people. So for every £88 they've spent on purchasing land, they can nominate somebody. Again, we're still looking for agricultural labourers and servants, and again we vary the amount of money that we expect them to find. And as you can see, right through until 1886, we have a range of schemes. Virtually all the rest are based on the last scheme that was 1862 in the 1860s. And in 1886, we give up the idea of assisted immigration, and right through until the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia, there's no more assisted immigration by the South Australian government. Now, one of the things that everybody finds out about when they try to find shipping records is that there are not many about. Thousands of vessels came out to South Australia, and only 700 passenger lists survive. And that's for the period from the beginning of the colony right through until 1886. So I'm only talking about that period. And in actual fact, there should be 2 passenger lists for every vessel. The shipping company should have created a passenger list which was accompanied by the captain all the way to South Australia. He should have given a copy of that passenger list to the last pilot to leave his vessel when he left British waters. And there should have been a 3rd list created by our customs department down at Port Adelaide as the people came off the boat. Now, in many cases of those 700 records that have survived, there are 3 lists, which seems a bit strange when one should have been given to the pilot back in England. Obviously, sloppiness was not was a feature of all of this. But we do find examples of 3 lists, and indeed on the screen you can see an example of all 3 lists which I found in state records, just proving that not always did the pilot in English waters get the list first of all. The other thing is, of course, our friend Lipson, who was the first harbour master at Port Adelaide, wasn't really a record keeper. He used to place the records down in the basement of the harbour master's premises in Port Adelaide, and if you've ever been on a tour of Port Adelaide, you know that the old Port Adelaide's under the roadways, and the high tides used to rise up through the basements, and so many of the shipping records became rather like saltwater paper mache. Indeed, it would seem that Lipson had tables of some sort down in the basement, and he just placed the shipping records on the tables, and when a pile got a bit high, he'd start a new pile. Because when the tides rose up through the piles, we often find the top layers of shipping records have survived, but they haven't survived in any chronological order, which indicates that he just sort of created piles all over the place, and so we get this sort of a mishmash. Because indeed, although these people that came out who bought tickets, they should have been on those passenger lists. The vast number of those records, those 700 records though that have survived, have been the records created by the South Australian government to account for all these assisted passengers. So they have survived, and they're the ones that most people get to use these days. Now, I've already mentioned that we don't need to just look at the shipping records, which are collectively by people called passenger lists, and I think that's a wrong thing to call them because they're really not. I like the terminology shipping records better. While the State Library has a large number of them, when it was originally the State Archives before it split into the State Records and State Library at our sesquicentenary time, the State Library created a record group of 67 different types of records, and you can go to this day to the family history section in the State Library and access those 67 groups of records. And just one of those groups happens to be shipping records, as I've already described. There are newspaper clippings, diaries and so forth, a whole range of other material that survived that can be used to build up a picture of the people who came to South Australia. If we go to state records, we can find even more material available to research. And indeed, if you look at the bar chart at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that it's a fairly good coverage of the period right up from the beginning of the establishment of the colony right through almost to 1900 of material that's available. One of probably the most interesting and fairly obscure records available to people that people are not really aware of are the facts that many government departments required people dealing with them to give personal information. And the standard question used to be in the 19th century, how did you come to South Australia? And indeed, if you look at the Adelaide Hospital records, admission records, you will find details of the arrivals of many of the, I was nearly going to say inmates, I've got to say patients, of the hospital. But of course the Destitute Asylum in Kintor Avenue did the same sort of thing. And there I think I can call them inmates. And so those admission registers are very useful. So we can use those records very effectively to find out information that we can't find in any other way. And there are a whole lot of other records available to researchers, not least of which a lot of them are listed on the screen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them individually, but one of the great untapped resources for all South Australian historians researching the history of the state have to be the government gazettes, which of course come out regularly, and I've already referred to one already. And there are certain editions of the government gazette which are very useful. For example, in January 1866, the government gazette of that day listed every person bound for South Australia for the previous 20-odd years who had died en route. And this is in one gazette, listed ship by ship, which is a very useful document. The government gazettes also list quarterly returns of immigrants, and while quarterly returns are not all that useful because they don't name the passengers, at least you get some idea of the ships that arrived and how many people that were on them. Now, as I said earlier, parallel to all these government-assisted schemes, we also have a whole range of other schemes operating as well. And we have to remind ourselves that just because our ancestors paid their passage, it didn't mean they sat up in the cabin. People in steerage also paid their passage. I have some people come to me sometimes say, oh, my ancestors paid their passage. They must have been, well-off people up in the cabin and all the comforts of the cabin. Well, in actual fact, they may have just purchased a steerage ticket and been down there with all the assisted immigrants as well. Interestingly enough, the shipping record for the China hasn't survived, but George Johnson just happened to need to make a bit of pocket money on the way, so he signed on as a cook's assistant, and he was paid a few bob for his efforts of helping the cook on the way out, and those sort of records are also available at State Records, so you never know, one of your ancestors might have been on a vessel where they offered to do some sort of menial task like that and get a small payment as a result. Let's start with some other groups of people that came to South Australia, and I think you can't in South Australia ignore German or Germanic people's impact on our colony, and I'll discount the myth that right away that everybody tells me that all the Germans who came out to South Australia were fleeing religious persecution. That's just not correct. The only ones who were fleeing religious persecution made up of a tiny percentage of Germanics, and they were the people that came out right at the beginning of South Australia with Pastor Carville, the people who settled at Clemzig and then subsequently went to Harndorf. The bulk of the Germanic peoples coming to South Australia were economic refugees, to use a modern term. I bet they didn't call themselves that. And a very large group of those people actually were people from the Harz Mountains in the Kingdom of Saxony. But the interesting thing is, of course, George Fife Angus, one of our well-known pioneer men, was involved with assisting Carville to bring his congregation out from Clemzig in Germany, and very generous benefactor. But of course, when they got here, who did they buy their land off of? But George Fife Angus. So I think he probably was well rewarded in the end. So in the 1850s, at any rate, we get this other group of Germanic peoples coming out, which are from the Harz Mountains, and they were actually all miners. And what was happening is in Hanover, the mines were being exhausted, and there was no work for them. And these people tended to find work in our mining industry here. They were a group of people that we now find fairly widely scattered around Victoria. Many of them went over to the Victorian goldfields and never came back, and quite a few people subsequently settled in the Wimmera, and another group of people went over to the mines in Western Australia and were settled in Kalgoorlie. When it comes to Germanic peoples coming out to South Australia, we don't find any surviving records prior to 1851. And then we don't find any again until 1855, when the records are fairly substantially surviving. So we have a lot of problem with the early Germanic people coming out to South Australia. A lot of people, including Dulcie Love, who you may know of, She's a member of the Genealogy Society, and her team of people have been for many years trying to work out or reconstruct, if you like, passenger lists from all the other records around parish registers, from the Lutheran archives, newspaper clippings and so forth, to try and see whether they can reconstruct passenger lists. The Hamburg archives have the records that have survived, and it's not the only port, of course, Germanic people emigrated from, but it's the only records that have survived, and there is a copy of that material in our state library and also at state records. And so if we look at the table, we can see that we can see the so-called old Lutherans fleeing religious persecution and the names of the vessels that they came out on the top of the screen. You can see they all came out in 1838, 1839 and 1841, with vessels like the Prince George and the Zebra being probably the most well-known. We had some political refugees come from Berlin in 1849 on one vessel, but as you can see at the bottom of the screen, the bulk of the immigrants in the early days to South Australia were the miners from the Kingdom of Hanover. And those are the names of the vessels on which they travelled out to South Australia on. Another large group of immigrants to South Australia were the Scots. And the bulk of the reasons for Scottish people coming out tended to be sponsored schemes by organisations such as those trying to address the problem of overpopulation in poor areas in Scotland, be they urban slum areas or remote rural areas as we get in the Western Isles, where there were just too many people and not enough jobs to go around. The other group of people we get coming out from Scotland are those that have been displaced by the Highland clearance schemes. And the Highland clearance scheme, the lairds were in actual fact encouraging their tenants to come to all of Australia, not just South Australia, because indeed it was actually cheaper for the laird to pay the passage of these tenants to come to Australia than it was to maintain them when times were tough. And it was much cheaper and much more economical practice to remove his tenants and replace them with sheep. And so many lairds engaged in that practice of encouraging, and I use encouraging in quotation marks because I think some of the encouraging was a bit violent, but there again a lot of it wasn't, and a lot of people saw the chance to get away from a very bleak life in any case. And so we get Scottish enclaves being created in South Australia, and probably the most well known to all of us here in Adelaide has to be Strathalbyn. But of course there were other enclaves in the mid-north and in the south-east. And in 1851 the British government realised that this was a fairly good idea and started lending lairds money to enable them to fund the process of paying for the cost of their tenants to leave the land and come to Australia, or Canada for that matter, not just Australia. And then again, as I've mentioned already, we have the emigration societies as well, who were philanthropic organisations trying to find better lives for people that were in dire circumstances. And one of those was the Highland and Island Emigration Society, and Her Majesty the Queen actually made a personal donation to that organisation. I understand it was £1,000 to assist them, and so did the Prince Albert. And the ships that brought people under that scheme to South Australia are listed on the screen, and probably the most famous of those is the Hercules, which got as far as Cork in Ireland when a disease broke out on the vessel and many people died. And when it returned to Scotland, some people decided that this was too much, they weren't coming, and while others came out on other vessels later on. You'll notice, of course, that some of those vessels didn't depart from Scotland. Scottish immigrants had to come down to Plymouth and Liverpool mainly to come to board their ships. These large coastal cities in the UK had emigration depots established, and the people would travel to those emigration depots and wait for the vessel to which they'd been allocated to set sail. In the late 1840s, we also have Earl Grey, who introduces a pauper immigration scheme whereby we see people in, by now, workhouses, because the Poor Law Act's been established in 1835, in which parishes in England were grouped into poor law unions, so they were then required to build a workhouse for the poor who were homeless. The poor that weren't homeless never went into workhouses. They stayed in their own homes and got issued with mainly food parcels. But we're talking about the poor that ended up in workhouses, be they, and in our case, Irish orphan girls seem to be the group that were mainly selected to come out to Australia, and 4 shiploads of Irish orphan girls came out to Adelaide, and those are the 4 ships from the late 1840s. I mentioned George Johnson, who came out on the China earlier, and he had many children, as was the wont of people in those days, and the eldest daughter married a fellow called Edward Dowsett, who was a captain down at Port Adelaide, who spent much of his time as master of the government schooner. And Edward Dowsett had a daughter who married a girl called Rutt. Now, the Rutt family came out, although I'm not related to them in any way, they came out in the 1839 as poor people and assisted people, and of course when they got here to South Australia they remained poor, and indeed they were placed in the immigration square, which was about where Adelaide High School is now, and within months both mum and dad were dead, and they had 4 girls, and I suppose you can imagine how those 4 teenage girls had to earn a living. And of course this has been a major problem in South Australia. It's all very well bringing these poor orphans out, and the Irish orphans are in the same boat, but when you get them to South Australia, if you then don't do something about their poverty, they have to resort to things like crime and especially prostitution, and then we have the government and all the do-gooders waving their hands in horror about these dreadful Irish girls. Well, this was a major problem, and unfortunately most of these Irish girls that did come out ended up in dire straits, and it wasn't just in Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney, it was the same sort of thing. There's an interesting book called Barefoot and Pregnant, which has been written about many Irish orphan girls being brought out to Australia, and the book tries to follow the fate of a number of those girls, and they all end up in dire circumstances. Now, I've mentioned before that just not shipping records are available to find all this information, but we can also find it all out from other records, and I've already mentioned the hospital records, which are a prime example. Being a very centralised colony, we only had one hospital here in South Australia, the then Adelaide Hospital, until the Mount Gambier Hospital was opened up in 1869. So we get a very long period of just one hospital in the whole of the colony. And so anybody who had some reason to go to hospital, there's a very good chance that you'll find their records, and they should have reported the name of the vessel on which they came out to South Australia. Kapunda Hospital started in 1877. That was the 3rd hospital. Sometimes we can find lists in newspapers about people arriving into South Australia. The problem with all our newspaper lists tend to be that, like the journalists of today, they are terribly inaccurate. The 2 newspapers, the Observer and the Register, would rush the reporters down, and they'd stand at the bottom of the gangplank, I suspect, and ask people their names as they came off the vessel. You can imagine somebody with a thickish accent being recorded completely wrongly. And indeed, not only is that a problem, but also usually they only recorded Mr. So-and-so. So you get Messrs. Jones, Williams, Smith and wife and 3 children and this sort of thing. And sometimes you'll even get reports of everybody in the cabin who paid a decent amount of money to come. You get all them named, and then on as a little add-on at the end you'll get and X number of passengers in steerage, which is a lot of help if they're one of yours. So I hope that's been of some interest to you tonight, and if you're interested in all this sort of material, the very best place to start all this looking is at the State Library. That's probably the most convenient one for you. And the State Records is another place. They've got a reading room in Lee Street. If you go to the reading room in Lee Street, be in for a bit of a well, I hope there's nobody from State Records here or the government. Be a bit disappointed because the Lee Street reading room doesn't hold records. They're held out at the Jetts Cross repositories, and the little man, I think, at Lee Street has to walk out to Jetts Cross to get them for you because it takes a very long time for them to come back. And indeed, it's better to, if you're in your car, to go out to Jetts Cross where the wait is a mere 20 minutes, which I can live with. I might add I curse driving out there, but at least the 20-minute wait, I can praise that. So if you do need to go to Lee Street to look at State Records materials, always ring up beforehand and order the stuff in so that it's there when you get there, or else take your credit card with you and go shopping in Rundle Mall for a couple of days while you wait for it. Are there any questions? Oh, that's good. Yes. Did it very efficiently, and so they would give the government discount if you charter my whole vessel. You know, it's a bit of a discount, whereas if you're just buying tickets at the gate or the gangplank, they're going to cost you a bit more. So it's a wee bit hard to say how much an actual ticket costs, but I think somewhere between £5 and £10 is a pretty good guesstimate. When my family came out in 1894, the JAUNAY, they went to Melbourne. There was Mum, Dad and 4 children. I still got the ticket. And it was £27, 10 and 6. But they did come on a fairly fast, efficient steamer. But I think somewhere between £5 and £10 would be a good guess. Now, there doesn't seem to be too much careful checking as to the financial status of the candidates. Otherwise, my George Dickinson, in my opinion, should never have got an assisted passage in his case. Yeah. Yes. But well, no, it's a very naughty thing to suggest, don't you think? I'm just wondering whether in his case it's a perk of the job. You know, like the car, if you're in the if you're out of a government department, you get a nice car. And it could have been that. I haven't found any details or records of anything that suggests that. It's just a theory of mine. Yes. No, it would seem not. It's fairly sloppy. For example, George Dickinson put down that he was a blacksmith. He never did any smithy work in South Australia. He just was a gentleman farmer. I suppose he could have been a blacksmith, but I mean, there's no indication that he ever was. And my George Johnson, his son-in-law, put down that he was a printer, and to my knowledge, he spent most of his time working on his farm at Houghton, and when he gave up the farm to his son, he moved into Houghton itself proper, and helped his son-in-law, a fellow by the name of Stokes, who did run the blacksmith shop in Houghton opposite the hotel that's no longer there. So I think it's fairly sloppy. The first census in South Australia that I have a copy of is the 1840 census, which is a tally only and reported in the registered newspapers in the middle of 1841. Along with the cultivators of South Australia reported in those same editions over several weeks of editions. Everybody living outside of the city of Adelaide who was running a farm of some sort and under cultivation was recorded by their name the address of their property and what they were operating their farm for, how many wells it had, what sort of fencing it had, and so on, and what crops they had in and the condition of the crops. That was in 1840. In 1841, the census was conducted right across the British Empire. The 1841 census, you can find examples of that in Canada, all of the United Kingdom, Ireland, and every Australian state, or colony as it was then. The 1841 census for South Australia survives, and indeed I've actually published it on a CD-ROM for people who have gone through and turned it into a database so that people can find the information. The trouble with the 1841 census in South Australia is, again, as I've already mentioned, sloppiness, in that it was seen that the enumerators are the people that go around handing out the householder schedules and coming and collecting them the next day, didn't do a very thorough job. The 1841 census accounts for approximately 17,000 people, and there are many examples of people that were missed. Anybody who lived south of Yankalilla, with the exception of Encounter Bay, and lived east of the Mount Lofty summit and a line drawn along there, and north of Gawler and the Barossa Valley, and west of our Gulf, were missed out. They just didn't count them at all. Now, how many people in 1841 were living outside there is anybody's guess. Yes. If you go and look in the registered newspapers for the middle of the 1840s, June, July, you'll find about in page 4 or 5 of each edition, nearly half a page dedicated to the summary of all this material. And for those people who had ancestors living here in South Australia by 1840, who were living outside the North Adelaide area, this is a very good way of locating them. And the next very good way, of course, is the 1841 census. The problem with the 1841 census is that only heads of household are named within the city of Adelaide and North Adelaide, and in most metropolitan villages only the head of the household's named. Then there's just so many boys under 7, so many boys under 14, so many men under 21, so many men under 35, so many men over 50 and so many men under 50, and then the same age range for women. So if you get a household, the head of the household, then you just get numbers in those appropriate columns, which is not all that helpful. When you go outside the metropolitan villages and the city itself, they start listing everybody in their families, husbands, wives and children. So in actual fact, both the 1840 and the 1841 censuses are very helpful for those who've got ancestors who don't live in populated areas. Yes. You've got a bit of a bed to lie on. And it's an opportunity to sit on the privy, I suppose. You didn't get much else. You got fed, but you had to bring all your own utensils and everything with you. And you got a baggage allowance, so much, I've been in metric so long, so many cubic feet of space in the hold to bring all your property. A very good book to read to find out the conditions people came out on is Parsons' book on shipping to South Australia. He's prepared a book which lists every vessel that comes to South Australia from 1836 to about 1865, I think. And so he's got every vessel, describes it, talks about its rigging, the name of the captain, the date it left, and the port it left from, the date it arrived, and which port it arrived in. That's interesting in itself, but in the front of that book there are several chapters of information about the conditions of which people endured. Essentially, these captains were paid to bring out people, so the quicker they could do it, the better. So they wouldn't make a landfall unless they absolutely had to. And they'd follow the wind pattern so that they'd get here as fast as they could. They'd offload the people as quickly as they could, and then they'd go looking for some cargo to take back to the UK to make the return voyage profitable. So you often find the vessels, when they arrive, there's immediately an advertisement in our local newspapers advising people that they're looking for cargo. And if they haven't found any within a relatively short time, you'll find them leaving Adelaide and going to larger ports like Melbourne and Sydney to try and pick up a cargo, or going across to India, or even what is now Indonesia, Batavia, to try and pick up a cargo to make it to pay for the return trip. So these vessels were not specifically built as passenger ships, they're actually cargo vessels as well. The very best example of what the conditions were like is to go to the Maritime Museum. There's a very good example there, very well done in my opinion, of the conditions that people have survived. Apparently spending most of their time wading in water up to their ankles at least, full of vomit and rats excreta and all of that sort of thing. Sounds very pleasant. When you run out of soup, you only have to get on your hands and knees and lap it up off the floor. Nice vegetable soup. Any others? Yes. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so many people, in actual fact, women's ages are notoriously rubbery in at the best of times. But indeed, by looking at those conditions, you can work out why your ancestors may have claimed to have been something that you didn't think they ever were, with regards to their occupation or their age. But which census did you find them in? The 1871 census. It only occurred. That'd be the last. If they came out in 1876, the last British census was in 1871 that would have had them. But of course, the census return is notoriously dangerous to take too much account of in any case, because well, people are very rubbery with their ages. I mean, men are rubbery with their ages when it comes to war. I mean, how many people do we know put their ages up to go to the First World War? And so people vary their age according to the needs. Many women put their ages up when they marry a man that's a lot older than themselves. Many women put their ages down if they're marrying a younger man, and so on. So the trouble with the census returns for Britain is you've got to be very careful with any census. I mean, be it a modern Australian census or whatever. I've heard people joking in, dare I say, pubs. I don't want to sound like I frequent the places, but I've heard people recently, with our last census, joking in pubs about the rubbish they put on our census, making themselves into eye specialists and goodness knows what. And I suspect that sort of thing happened in the 19th century too. I mean, we're still human beings. And also we have to realise that when you go back, not so much to the 1871 census, when you go back to the 1841 British census, many people, that was the first census, by the way, in which people's names were recorded. Many people were very hostile about that because in the Bible it says you shouldn't count people and all this sort of thing. So we've got lots of hostility towards that. But rather much like we had when there was a suggestion previously by the Keating government that we'd introduce an Australia card. And we're just interested to see what's going to happen this time round. By hook or by crook, I suspect that we'll all be carrying a card sooner or later. But indeed, in the 1841 census, the general population of the United Kingdom were reacting very strongly against the census, and many people just gave false information. By 1871, that had pretty well settled down. But you imagine the enumerator comes around and leaves the householder's schedule there, and nobody in the household's literate. So back comes the enumerator the next day. They've got to put something down. Oh, he probably is a local, so he makes an educated guess. Or little Tommy answers the door. And where's Mum and Dad? Oh, they're out at work. Oh, well, I'll ask you, little Tommy, for the information. So be very careful with any records generated by human beings have to be treated with some caution. I've put everybody totally off. Yes. Well, it wouldn't have been it would have been after Suez before they could have joined the ship in Colombo, because no ship coming to South Australia from the UK went to Colombo intentionally. If they were bringing out immigrants, they would have gone to Rio, and the Cape would have been the two major places to call in, and of course Swan River Colony or Albany or the other ports, but they would very rarely, sometimes the Canary Islands, but they wouldn't go up to Colombo. That's out of their way. Now, if you're talking after the Suez Canal, of course, Colombo became a regular port of call. So when are we talking about? before the Suez Canal. But there's an extensive network of trade going on between South Australia and the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Little ships going backwards and forwards all the time. Sexton's book, which outlines every arrival in and departure, for that matter, in South Australian ports from 1670, I think he starts, right through until 1850, is very useful for finding that. You get little ships, tiny little ships, heading off for remote places. You wouldn't think, almost rowboat size, and you find them going to places like Batavia and so forth. Many ponies were brought down from Batavia, for example, for South Australia. There's a big trade going on with these smaller ships, but these aren't the immigrant ships. They also carried passengers as well. I mean, if you look at the passenger lists and records of these small ships, you'll find people on board them all the time, coming from places like Hobart, Launceston, Swan River, and up into India and so forth. But finding the record, of course, none of the stuff's indexed, so you'd be very hard-pressed to locate it unless you had some fairly precise dates of arrival that you could go through and look at a whole raft of those sort of shipping records for that period. Now, I don't know how long this is allowed to go on for you, but it stopped me when... There was a big fight over the 1841 census, and we seem to be getting a bit off the topic. I'm very sorry about this, but anyway. The 1841 census, the government organised to take it, they organised its legislation in late 1840, and they decided the Adelaide City Council would do the Adelaide City. And of course there was a bit of a toing and froing because the Adelaide City Council, who was already in dire straits because it couldn't know how to run itself properly, was trying to work out where it was going to get the readies from to do this. So there was a big fight between the government and the council about it. And there was exchange of letters between the Colonial Secretary and the Town Clerk. And in those exchange of letters, which I've got, in 12th of December, the Town Clerk indicates he's going to try and get it done by Christmas. So in actual fact, if he did, it was done around Christmas 1840. However, Port Lincoln, which is the most remote spot that was done in that census, wasn't done until the following April. And everywhere else was somewhere in between those two dates. Okay? Good. Thank you.